tone down what they did and said. This is one of the reasons why the sort of two folk heroes of this period, of the early civil rights movement, are Booker T. Washington, who founded the Tuskegee Institute, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the prominent figures who founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Booker T. Washington, they had very different lives. Booker T. Washington had been born a slave. He was 9 years old when he was emancipated. He grew up during the Reconstruction period. He benefited from the educational opportunities, and he became an educator. And he founded the Tuskegee Institute in 1881 to provide a place where African Americans could come and get the skill training. I will come back to him, but I want to give a little bit more focus to W.E.B. Du Bois, because we're going to be spending more time with him over the course of the term. W.E.B. Du Bois had a very different background. He was born in western Massachusetts in 1868 in the town of Great Barrington. His people had been in New England and upstate New York since at least the 1730s. His paternal grandfather had been a sea captain based in New Haven who specialized in trade between the United States and the Caribbean. His mother's family had been independent farmers in western Massachusetts for many generations. This was a family that had no family memory of ever having been slaves, though presumably the family was in New England and New York because of the either 17th or early 18th century slave trade. His mother's family was one of 30 black families in the Berkshire area, Berkshire Hills area, mountains area of western Massachusetts, who, while not wealthy, were secure landowners and even could be considered prosperous. Things began to change in the decade following Du Bois's birth. The agricultural revolution that we discussed a bit was making it more difficult for farmers in New England to make a living. They couldn't compete with farmers in the Midwest or the Great Plains. And yet the costs of doing business for them were rising. And farmers with rivers or large streams on their properties either sold their land to industrialists or converted their farms to textile and paper mills, whose operatives, the factory hands, were the thousands of Irish, German, Czech, and French-Canadian immigrants who were flooding into the region searching for work. Most black farmers, and certainly not Du Bois's family, did not have the financial resources or the type of land that would allow them to profit from the Industrial Revolution that was underway in their community. So the family, instead of selling their land all at once, tried to manage their fiscal problems by selling off strips of its land to pay off its debts. And then they went to work largely as waiters and cooks in the developing tourist industry, the tourist resorts in the nearby Berkshires. These were jobs that paid considerably more than any of the factory positions that foreign immigrants were taking. So Du Bois grew up during the decline of farming that lowered the status of most blacks in rural New England. Were it not for the opening of a public high school in 1869, Du Bois likely would have participated. He would have shared in the sort of process of downward mobility affecting many white and most black farmers in New England. But he was a top-notch student, by far the best in the school. The principal of his high school took responsibility for Du Bois's future and raised money from the leading citizens of Great Barrington to send him to college. Du Bois wanted to go to Harvard, but his sponsors felt that it would be more comfortable for them to send him to a Negro college, and he was sent off to Fisk University, which was a Congregationalist school for blacks in Nashville, Tennessee. Founded in 1866, originally to train teachers and ministers, but quickly the school became a liberal arts, four-year liberal arts college. And indeed, experts on education in the 1870s and 80s usually spoke of Fisk as the single best university in the entire South because of the quality of its teachers and the rigorous standards they set for their students. Du Bois had never been outside of New England. He had no family in the South. He was going to a foreign country. He had grown up in a what we could call a racially liberal environment where if blacks were not equal to whites, they still had standing in the community. And they were still, at this time, socially superior to the European immigrants. So in the racial totem pole, they were certainly not at the top, but they were not at the bottom either. Du Bois later wrote that he grew up with most of the prejudices of New England Anglo-Saxons. And he looked down at other people, such as Irish immigrants or rural blacks in the South, as semi-civilized people. So crossing into Kentucky on his way to Tennessee for the first time in his life, he was required to ride in a separate car for blacks. But he found being in an all-black environment to be completely thrilling. And while at Fisk, he formed the idea that there could be no progress for blacks without the leadership that college-bred men and women could provide. And he taught at schools in the black farming communities outside Nashville, and he developed an appreciation for the rich cultural life that blacks had developed despite slavery. And this would be reflected in many of the chapters of Souls of Black Folk, his bestseller from 1902, written some years later. But he also saw how deeply in debt most of his students' families had become, so deeply in debt that they were living in what amounted to peonage to the person who owned the loans or the general store. And they were so poor that his students often were pulled out of school in order to help with the field work. He also saw that a majority of the young men and women in the farming communities where he was teaching, when they reached 16, 17, or 18, they decided to leave the farm and go to the city, often Nashville itself, but many also were starting to move up north where they could get factory jobs. He also learned how dangerous life in the South could be. His first year at Fisk, there was a lynching outside Nashville. In this case, it was the leading white Nashville newspaper editor who was killed for crusading against corruption. And he noted that many of his fellow students carried a gun with them when they left campus and went into town. He, coming from New England and having been raised in a different kind of cultural environment, never felt comfortable carrying a loaded weapon with him. But one day while in town shopping, he accidentally brushed against a white woman on the street. He doffed his hat in apology, as would be normal for someone who has inadvertently bumped into somebody, only to have her explode at him in rage for presuming to act as a social equal. He was then threatened by several of the white men there and just somehow or other was able to get out of it. He recalled that he never again knowingly raised his hat to a Southern white woman, since it could be so easily interpreted as a sexual insult, as a claim of social equality. He graduated from Fisk in 1888, and he was accepted into Harvard as a graduate student. Again, the town of Great Barrington, the city leaders in Barrington, raised money to pay for his fees while studying at Harvard. This again was the moral economy of 19th century United States. If someone, if a young man was of limited means but of great talent, the community at large was supposed to make sure that he received the training he needed. He was the sixth African American to be admitted to Harvard, and there was only one other black student during his years there. He did a degree in history and economics, and he wrote his dissertation on the suppression of the African slave trade to the United States. His Harvard years were successful, and they led to his being able to study in Germany. And again, the citizens, the leaders of Great Barrington, gathered together money and paid for him to spend 2 years studying at Humboldt University in Berlin. In 1894, he returned to the United States to become an assistant professor at Wilberforce College in Ohio, which is the oldest historically black college in the United States. He then moved to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and then he settled as a professor at Atlanta University, where he lived and worked from 1898 to 1910. While in Philadelphia and then in Atlanta, Du Bois set out to organize studies of black community and family life to find out what basis there was for the common belief that blacks were not capable of participating fully in modern democratic life. And he was trying to challenge the assumption guiding all middle-class leaders, both black and white, that black working men and women were dangerous and needed a strong hand rather than freedom. As part of this effort to begin to develop actual studies of what was going on in the black working class communities, he and several other black professors formed what was called the American Negro Academy. And this is how he came to know Booker T. Washington, because he was invited to participate. Out of this research, Du Bois developed what would be a central argument of his, which was that the double consciousness of African Americans, an argument that would be the basis for his book, The Souls of Black Folk, but would also be argued in his more scholarly works. The argument in favor of disenfranchisement had been that black Americans did not share the same values as white Americans, and therefore there was no basis for their effective participation in U.S. institutions. This had not been Du Bois's experience growing up in Massachusetts, but he also